Welcome. Step into the Mindora Lab. On this podcast, we will be discussing the practices, research, science, and technology surrounding alternative medicine, where listeners will gain valuable insight and information with every episode. Just as a reminder, the Mindora Lab podcast is for educational and informational purposes solely. All subjects discussed on this podcast should not be construed as medical or legal advice. You should always seek out help from a professional provider. Thank you. Hello everyone. Today I have the honor and privilege to interview Dr. Codi Peterson. Dr. Peterson, thank you for being here.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I love the opportunity to educate at every chance I get, so I appreciate you.
Thank you so much. So just to get right into it, where are you from? Where'd you grow up? What'd you study in college?
I am from small town America, Western Pennsylvania to be exact.
Okay.
So I grew up in a very small college town in rural Pennsylvania, where my family, the Petersons, have lived for basically since the Revolutionary War.
Wow.
Proud to be there. Just lost my grandmother of 98
So
years.
sorry to hear that. That's a long time, though.
She was a blessed woman with lots of progeny, and we're very thankful for her. Rest in peace, Grandma. So I grew up in Western Pennsylvania, Meadville to be exact. And I then hopped down to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where I got my doctorate in pharmacy, my PharmD, from Duquesne University. And it was there in Pittsburgh where I developed an affinity for the cannabis herb.
Interesting. So prior to that, what were you thinking about getting into for a career?
Ooh, good question. I was actually a month away from going to Penn State University to study agricultural engineering, or potentially ceramic engineering. So I was going to be an engineer when I spent some time shadowing my big sister, who's also a pharmacist. And I said, oh, hey, I like talking to people. This job could work for me. And so I switched and applied to a few pharmacy schools right at the last minute and was accepted to a couple and chose Duquesne now.
Wow. So initially you weren't looking to get into medicine?
No, not even close. In fact, that was a midnight decision, the day before the thing was due. I had a week or two to do my applications for 2 or 3 more schools. And so it was an audible, life audible.
And your influence was directly through your sister, just being able to see that?
Yeah, exactly. I got into a hospital. I got into the setting and talked about medicine and talked about drugs and saw the operations. And I said, oh, yeah, I get this. I like this. But really, it was all about liking to talk to people. I just enjoy connecting.
So the chemistry aspect of it, were you always a chemistry nerd?
I still wouldn't call myself a chemistry nerd. I'm more of a pharmacology nerd. Chemistry is an underpinning there where you have to appreciate functional groups and things of that nature. But chemists, really like organic processes and moving, manipulating the chemical structure of a molecule. I'm more like a biochemistry nerd. I really like talking about how a protein, or really pharmacology, like how this interaction of a drug, which is a chemical, and this protein, biochemical, interact to produce a tangible pharmacologic response. So I'm a science nerd, a life biology nerd, but mostly it's pharmacology that gets me.
We share that same interest. So I was pre-medicine when I studied at UNLV, and biochemistry was definitely one of my favorite courses, just judging by all the interactions that are happening through external to internal and everything that we're ingesting. It's just amazing how intricate our systems are connected on the inside.
Absolutely. We talk about enzyme inhibition in pharmacy sometimes. And if you take one medicine, it'll inhibit an enzyme and then it'll lead to a drug effect. But actually, it's not just about medicine. If you've ever looked at warfarin or certain prescription medicines, there's a warning label that says, do not take with grapefruit juice. And the reason is that the chemicals in grapefruit juice inhibit these enzymes, one in particular that's important for metabolizing drugs. But it's not just that. It's grape juice, apple juice, orange juice. All of these contain certain chemicals that
Mm-hmm.
make the body process something, and in order to either use it for energy or expel it. And because of that, a lot of foods, whether we recognize it or not, actually have some drug interactions. It's just whether they're clinically meaningful.
Right. And I mean, to the later, or for the audience, it's like, do you really think about that on a day-to-day basis of the things that you consume throughout your day having different interactions that are inhibiting or, um, for a matter of fact, amplifying the effects of the things that you're ingesting and how you're feeling throughout the day? I think that's a subject that needs to be covered more about the gut and the brain axis, because there's so much information there to be researched.
Yeah, I think in a lot of ways you're talking about mindfulness, which we could all use a little bit. It's like, oh, I'm feeling anxious. Well, are you feeling anxious because you had 3 cups of coffee and you didn't get enough sleep last night? And you didn't,
Right.
it's like recognizing what we put in our body and the effect, and that includes THC from cannabis. This has a very tangible pharmacological effect, even for tolerant users, and it has an impact on our mood and on our day to day. Denying that, saying only good, I've only ever had good weed experiences, it's a bit of a lie. So I've
Yeah.
experienced some negative consequences. We got a little lazy, we got a little tired, we got a little something that we weren't anxious, something we weren't really intending, and that's a side effect. That's what makes pharmacology people exceptionally well groomed for the cannabis space, because cannabis is a medicine, then it acts and behaves like a medicine, then we can expect the same thing: pharmacologic positive effects, pharmacologic negative effects, contraindications, dosing, inter-individual variability. So much of what medicine and pharmacy is, cannabis is also.
So for the audience, can you break down the endocannabinoid system? I know that at surface level, there is this baseline understanding of how our receptors are interacting with these molecules coming from cannabis or even psychedelics, and um, how they how the molecules interact with our body.
Yeah, it's a complicated subject. I like to give full lectures on the topic, but let's try to put it down into a 1 or 2 minute soundbite for you. The endocannabinoid system is a homeostatic regulatory system. So keeps things in balance, homeostasis, and by fine tuning all of the other systems in our bodies. So our brain, which is one of the most complex structures in the known universe, is covered in these cannabinoid receptors, or satellite dishes on the outside of our cells that are part of this homeostatic regulatory system. And those satellite dishes are all around all the cells in the brain. And what they're doing is they're receiving a message produced by your body to explain that they have received the message and to send that message back. So it's a bit of a feedback loop for the body and brain. And this system, the endocannabinoid system, is an ancient system, 600 million years old, and preserved in all living animals on Earth. So every animal with a spine has the system that we're talking about. And the system has 5 primary functions, which is to deal with eating, sleeping, resting, digest, and protect. So those are sort of like the 5 major things that the endocannabinoid system is doing. But it's involved in everything from the motility, or the ability of our sperm to swim. There's an endocannabinoid system function there. To
What?
the regulation of our body temperature, which is why when you smoke some THC, you get kind of chilly. There's so many things that it regulates, which explains why medical cannabis has been ascribed to have benefit in so many different topics, because this system is in nearly every cell type in the human body. and it performs countless roles in those tissues, and it's tissue specific as well. So the endocannabinoid system can be doing something different in the heart than it's doing in the lungs at the same time. So it's a master regulatory system inside of all of us that runs on fats that are from our diet and from our cell membranes. It uses those fats to create balance molecules that try to fine tune the sort of ups and downs of life, whether it's in our brains or in our bodies. However, that system, the endocannabinoid system, cannabinoids from within, can also be stimulated by THC, which is a phytocannabinoid plant. And so I guess that's where I'll stop my definition, and then you can let me know what you'd like to clarify.
Yeah, no, that was such a good analogy. I've never had that broken down as in a satellite to receiving information packet, because that is basically biology in its overall definition of the body internally, is that we're constantly having compounds interact with our receptors, and then those receptors send the information that needs to get coded from those bound compounds, molecules, etc. And I love how you touched base on how complex this is throughout the body. Not only is it, affecting the brain, it's affecting other major organs throughout your body as well, and they're all having a different interaction. And what fascinates me the most is that with everyone and their biology, it's all unique to how these phytocannabinoids, I love that you made that distinction as well, because it is important to understand that this is coming from plant-based, and then the endocannabinoid system are all of our internal regulatory compounds that are being released. These phytocannabinoids that are being ingested, inhaled, etc., are going to affect every individual at a different level of either severity or not even have any effect at all.
Exactly. And it's going to affect all of our systems simultaneously. So this endocannabinoid system is in each different, tissue or organ system performing its own function. But when you introduce THC, the phytocannabinoid most of us know and love, when you ingest it, it doesn't just calmly and thoughtfully regulate the body. It stimulates the system in all the tissues. So even though you're looking to numb the pain that you're experiencing in, say, your belly, or got a stomach ache, or you're nauseous, you'd like to smoke some marijuana, and let's say you do that, it also activates the cannabinoid receptors in our tear ducts. And what happens? We get dry eye. It also interacts with the cannabinoid receptors, leading to a change in chemical balance in our salivary glands. So what happens? We get dry mouth. It interacts with the endocannabinoid systems in the sleep-wake part of our brain. And so what happens? We tend to get stimulated at first and then sleep shortly after. So there are very different, but you were only taking it to deal with the pain in your stomach, So This is medicine. And because of that, it does this. So THC, if you think about why it's on the plant, Dorian, we're talking about a plant that made a defensive molecule. We don't really know why, but it's THC and cannabinoids are antibacterial, antiviral. They have all these qualities. Why? Because they're protruding off the plant, trying to ward off things and protect the plant from sunlight. So when we consume it, we think of it as medicine, and we learned how to use it as medicine. But the plant made it as poison. Didn't make it per se to get us high.
Right.
And especially when you get away from THC, that's definitely not why the plant is making. But it's really interesting to think about it in this way. And the thing I like to point to is this is similar to nicotine. Did you know that the tobacco plant has trichomes?
No, I actually didn't.
Yeah, resinous trichomes filled with a poison to ward off insects known as nicotine.
Huh.
Yeah. It's pretty wild, but it's true. And there are many plants that make trichomes with defensive molecules in them.
Mm-hmm.
So what we're seeing is another one of nature's beautiful defense systems that learned how to interact with the 600 million year old system found in all animals. And THC has a different effect on all different animals for that very reason. So humans, you can't really overdose. Dogs, you can technically. Mice, they overdose. If you gave them a large dose of THC, they die.
Wow. No, I had no idea about those, that for animal models for that matter. I know that there hasn't been a documented case on overdosing for any of the phytocannabinoids quite yet, and I hope that never comes to fruition because, I mean, as humans, we like to take things to the excess, and we've seen that with many other compounds that we ingest, inhale on a daily basis, that we don't think twice about putting into our bodies. But yeah, there's still a lot of research that needs to be done in this space. So, you know, with your experience with alternative medicine, when did you make the switch from pharmacy to studying more about cannabis?
Yeah, great question. I still do both. Still work
Okay.
full time in a hospital, practicing Western medicine alongside physicians in emergency department.
Uh-huh.
I decided to make the switch when I was made aware of a new program at the University of Maryland, Science and Therapeutics. So my buddy clued me into that program. My employer had some recent shifts in its education reimbursement, and knowing how much it cost me to go to pharmacy school, those sort of two things needed to align, and they did. And I went back to school. So that was 2019,
Mm-hmm.
2020. And so I've been leaning into this space heavily for the last few years. Um, but the seed, was planted back in 2000 when I
Okay.
first became sort of a cannabis consumer, and then also 2010 was able to help a loved one, or a loved one of my girlfriend at the time, deal with the end of her life with the help of cannabis medicine.
Oh, wow.
And so we helped grandma pass away with pancreatic cancer, uh, and it really left a mark, and I didn't forget that.
Mm-hmm.
Here I am, thankful to be helping people every day navigate this crazy world that is cannabis.
Yeah, man, those are some life-changing moments for you for sure. I think that is super awesome that you are able to recognize this as an alternative option, especially for that person who passed away, and help easing their pain to make their life a little bit easier before they left this world. I think it's important to bring up those stories, especially when you ask people the why of why they got involved in cannabis, and each person also has a motivating experience that's like, okay, why is this still scheduled as a Schedule 1 drug, right? Why have we not made significantly more progress in America to make this more available and more researched for that matter?
Yeah, particularly on the herbal plant side. This is a bloody plant. We're talking about an herb, a flower. Like, what in the hell? It doesn't
Mm-hmm.
make any sense why you would regulate plants like this. And if the idea is to slow down the availability of cannabis, I think we can all agree that we failed, whether it's cannabis or
Yeah.
cocaine or heroin, which we finally stopped heroin. Look at what we got. We get fentanyl instead. And
Yeah.
so, I mean, this is a pathetic excuse for a drug war. It's really a war on plants. Drugs are flowing just fine,
Right.
and it needs to be over. And once we get rid of prohibition, we can start to get more evidence, for better or worse. Like cannabis isn't going to be perfect. We're going to continue to find negatives to this plant because it's not a perfect medicine, but it is a useful medicine that can help with countless diseases and can be integrated into other techniques. So for me, it's a no-brainer.
So when did you first use cannabis? Like, was it that point that changed your whole perspective of the plant?
I was a senior in high school.
Mm-hmm.
I was at a approaching graduation. I was, hanging around with some old buddies, guys who've always smoked weed, and I had never tried. And I was interested, attempted as a young teenage mind might be,
Mm-hmm.
and was distressed about it. Went inside, uh, ran into Galen's father, and expressed these concerns. Like, I don't know, I'm afraid, I don't want to. And he said, "Why? What are you actually afraid of?" And thought about it. I said, like getting in trouble, right, breaking the rules.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, basically, fuck those rules. They're not. They're made up by people in power to keep us in a box. And this was a friend of mine's dad. And I said, yeah, I mean, it's not dangerous. He says, go ahead and try. So I did, and that sort of planted a different seed. And eventually, when I got to college, it became a bigger part of my life. But Galen's dad, that was basically the last thing he said to me. He passed away just a couple weeks later.
Wow.
After I played hockey with this gentleman for a few years, so it was impactful words, and I didn't forget them. And I still don't to this day.
Man, that's another significant moment in your life. Seems like
In my plant medicine
these,
life, I would agree.
yeah, no, there's just like these messages come at you by someone that's basically crossing paths with you, and then you don't see them again, right? And then you
Right.
you continue to pursue this fight that you have for pushing it forward. I love that. So with that being said, can you break down some of the research that you have discovered to the audience in the cannabis industry?
Hmm. Oh, there's so much to try to unpack. I think one thing that gets stated a lot, if I'm just thinking of things that I would want to talk about,
Mm-hmm.
it's said a lot that there are 160 cannabinoids, and while that's kind of true, we've discovered that many cannabinoids in extracts and of things in the plant.
Mm-hmm.
Really, we're talking about like 6 molecules, right? And it all comes from the same mother cannabinoid, which is CBGA,
Mm-hmm.
and then that can be converted naturally in the plant to THCA, CBDA, and CBCA. Those molecules can then be decarboxylated, and they have to be in order to cross the blood-brain barrier. So we talk about this when you're baking brownies. You got to throw your wheat in the oven for 30 minutes before, and then put it in the brownies. Or you have to light your cannabis herb on fire. If you just ate the herbal cannabis, the fresh buds, you wouldn't get high. So that's the decarboxylation step. So either CBDA, THCA, or CBCA can all decarboxylate, and they do when lit on fire. And then THC degrades into CBN, a more stable version of the molecule, but it looks structurally and pharmacologically behaves quite similar. So all those molecules I just listed make up for the vast majority of the cannabinoids that people are running into on a day-to-day basis.
Right.
There's tiny amounts of these other cannabinoids, but pharmacologically, when we're considering drugs and products, I mean, there's no real agreement on what is minuscule, but these other molecules are in minuscule amounts, a lot of them. But the ones I
Mm-hmm.
just mentioned, pretty abundant.
Yeah, and I recognized that when I was doing extraction with CO2. I would do different forms of, I would take raw material from greenhouse, from outdoor, from indoor, and I would see a variety of the minor cannabinoids along with the THC molecule, and they would vary from grow technique. And it was always awesome to see that the outdoor plants were producing the full variety of what the actual cannabis bud was going to release in terms of after decarboxylation and what would be available to the consumer. And I found that super fascinating. So, to the audience, can you explain the effects that some of they're not very known, like CBG and CBC, how they interact with your body.
Yeah, I would love to. So I agree. There's some data actually that just in a 2022 study that was published that says that outdoor flower
Mm-hmm.
exposed to the full spectrum of the sun produces fewer terpenoids. The cannabis herb has fewer smelly molecules, but it has a broader spectrum. So the flavor is more deep, it's richer, it's wider, instead of pungent and in your face and sort of one thing. Then they
Yeah.
looked at the cannabinoids. And in the cannabinoid section, we saw something very similar. Indoor plants make more THCA or CBDA. They make more of it. They've been bred for it. They're getting fed a lot of light every day consistently, as
Right.
opposed to outdoor plants that don't, but they get the real sun. And that real sunlight produces a broader spectrum of minor cannabinoids. So we get more of these one-off cannabinoids like THCV or THCP, as in Paul. And we see these other minors as, of questionable pharmaceutical significance, but at scale, it can definitely make a difference. So some of those molecules, like THCV, so everyone knows THC. And THC is a partial agonist, a partial activator. Think of it as a dimmer switch. It turns the dimmer switch halfway on at the CB1 and CB2 switch, the satellite dish, the receptor.
Right.
So THC turns that light halfway on. Now, THC has a 5-carbon fatty Velcro tail. Okay, so it's this long fatty tail that likes to get stuck and stick into that receptor. THCV, as in Victor, THCV has a 3-carbon fatty tail. So as you might expect, it's got less attraction and less affinity for those CB1 and CB2 receptors. But it still goes there. And it just sticks in there less difficult or less strongly. And so what we see is a change in pharmacology. So THCV might not be associated with weight gain and eating, but instead be associated with overall eating less. And maybe instead of THC, which has a tendency to make us a little spacey, not necessarily help us focus, THC has been reported to maybe help with focus. So it's doing different things in the same receptors. Now, we can take that fatty Velcro tail and we can make it longer. So THCP is in Paul. THCP is a 7-carbon tail. It's much longer, stickier, and has a much higher attraction for that receptor than even THC, which is only 5 carbons. That 7-carbon tail has 30 times greater attraction, affinity for the CB1 receptor. And it may be even, milligram for milligram, 2 times or more potent than THC. So what 5 milligrams of THC does to you, 2 milligrams of THCP will do. So this longer carbon tail, again, in these sun-grown flowers, seems to show up more often.
No, that's fucking awesome. It's just so fascinating that, and this is what I always loved about biology, especially, is that the chains with molecules and the different functional groups, just changing one position or multiple positions slightly alters the effect, or amplifies the effect for that matter, on what your body is going to experience. So I actually didn't know that about the THCP, because I've heard of THCV before, but I've never heard of THCP. So that's great. Something I've never knew about. So with the CBG, could you explain a little bit about what that does?
Totally. So we're talking about chemical structure. We talked about that long chain. CBD, THC, and CBG all share that same 5-carbon tail. Okay, and they can all come in those different V's or P's, or there's B's and H's as well. Okay, so they can all come in all these variants. So that's like a layer of complexity here. But let's just talk quickly about CBD. So when we talk about all the THCs, that's a tricyclic chemical structure. So 3 rings bound together. If you can imagine 1, 2, 3 rings all bound together, that's a pretty rigid structure. You can't spin it 360 degrees. Those rings are going to get caught on each other.
Right.
So that's THC's rigidity is also what gives it that selectivity. It helps it go specifically to CB1 and CB2. Now, when you go to CBD, cannabidiol, one of probably the best known cannabinoid, period. When you're talking about CBD, you're actually talking about 2 rings, so a bicyclic structure that's separated by a string. Now, if you can imagine 2 rings separated by a string, that can spin and be manipulated and move into all sorts of different positions. And this is indeed what we see pharmacologically with CBD, as a highly promiscuous, funky molecule that can do a lot of different things in a test tube, but in the body is quite unpredictable. So that's THC, CBD. Now let's go back to cannabigerol, CBG, as in Gerald. CBG is a monocyclic molecule. So it has that same 5-carbon tail that THC does, but instead of having these 2 rings, it's just got a really long fatty arm over there. So it's got a fatty tail and this fatty arm. And what this ends up meaning pharmacologically is that it behaves very different than the other 2. It appears to have very minimal effects on CB1 and CB2. So does CBD. It doesn't have a whole lot of action at many of the CBD receptors, but it does have one receptor action that is super interesting that I want to point out, and that it has affinity and action at something known as the alpha-2 receptor.
Alpha-2. Okay.
Now, alpha and beta are part of what's called the sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight system, the epinephrine system, adrenaline. All right, you following me?
Yep.
So alpha-2 is part of the adrenaline system, but it's actually a feedback receptor itself. So activating the alpha-2 receptor actually calms down the nervous system. And that's exactly what we see with cannabigerol. We see that it activates with a lot of potency, the type of potency that pharmaceutical companies would be very interested in. It activates the alpha-2 receptors in the body, which should hypothetically give it an anxiety busting, focus enhancing, heart rate reducing, effect in general.
So yeah, for the CBG, that's fucking awesome, because when I would actually source raw material from farmers in Oregon for my CO2 oil, I would look for higher CBG results and their test results, because I noticed that when I started getting a significantly lower THC to CBD, CBG, CBN ratio, that those oil cartridges would specifically mellow me out more, and I would not have to feel so racy all the time. And those are my go-to when I needed to have some muscle relaxation, to be able to enjoy like a walk outside with my dog, or even if I was going on a hike, smoking that immediately afterwards would just like calm everything down and just kind of reset me overall. So you going through those effects and that specific receptor that's getting bound to makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it's super interesting, and there's actually pharmaceuticals that target this receptor as well. First one that comes to mind is clonidine. It's a potent activator of this receptor. It's used for withdrawal. It's used for anxiety. It's used for ADHD. And then the other one is guanfacine, which once again is usually used for, like ADHD.
So with these cannabinoids specifically, what vehicles are the best, in your opinion, to be delivered to the system? I mean, I know it's going to be variable for person to person, but what do you see as most effective?
When you say vehicles, do you mean route of administration?
Correct.
Yeah. Well, anytime we're dealing with a maintenance medicine and not a medicine that's PRN as needed. So if your problem is anxiety attacks and CBG has a tendency to help you, keeping an inhalable version of that around, or THC if it works, is a good idea. However, if you're having underlying baseline anxiety and you're going through your day with anxiety, an inhalable version is not a desirable route of administration because the onset is fast and duration is short. It doesn't last very long. So you need something that you're able to use throughout the day. So I would recommend an oral, whether that's a gummy or whether that's an under the tongue oil, whether that's some sort of mints that you take 3 times a day, something like that, for anyone who's dealing with a chronic condition, whether that's neuropathy, whether that is inflammation, joint pain, anxiety, ADHD. One problem I see in the space today is we're all very reliant on inhalables because it's great, but
Mm-hmm.
honestly, like smoking is only mediocre because of how regularly.
Yeah, no, I would definitely attest to that because it is something that is quick, and then the bad part about that is that yeah, you get the immediate effects. However, people tend to go overboard with smoking excess, right? And then you get into those moments where you're either too excited or you're too subdued. And then it becomes okay, I why did I do this to myself? Or the other side of it is that you build up the tolerance and then don't really feel those effects at all, and then you continue to just push and push and push, and you never really return back to baseline. So I guess my next question would be, for people that are using that quick onset for inhalation, what's a good downtime in between using?
I'm sorry, you're gonna have to repeat the question, Dorian.
My question would be, so when people are using an inhaled method of delivery, is there a good downtime between usage to avoid building up tolerance?
So typically, you have to wait 3 to 5 half-lives of that drug. I would say that if you're really trying to avoid all tolerance, then
Mm-hmm.
you wouldn't want to be smoking more than every few days. Now, tolerance is not the worst thing either. Sometimes, hypersensitivity to these substances can be challenging in a social setting and whatnot. But if you're truly trying to avoid tolerance, it would have
Mm-hmm.
to be less frequent than every day. Because the THC and THC metabolites linger in our body, or CBG, CBD, they have a tendency to linger in our body up to 24 hours. So if
Mm-hmm.
you're consuming every 24 hours, you'll start to accumulate those molecules, even if it only a small amount. If you're smoking all day, every day, especially smoking in the morning, you'll
Mm-hmm.
build tolerance the quickest. So if you were trying to ask me, like, how do I avoid tolerance as best I can, it would be
Mm-hmm.
to avoid the wake and bake.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, just to avoid tolerance. Again, like to
Right.
each their own. Everyone's got a life in their own flow, but just because of the important nature of the endocannabinoid system in the morning, that would be my recommendation. But realistically, less frequently than every day is probably the answer to avoid tolerance. Not every day.
Right, and that's just something that I've noticed too with, taking supplements, is that even on the labels they'll include that you should run a course for a week and then take a couple of days off to avoid tolerance and have the maximized effect. So I think the thing with recreational versus medicinal is that medicinal patients are dealing with ongoing chronic symptoms where they're going to have to take this cannabinoid to alleviate symptoms, versus recreational, which is just being used in social setting or just everyday life of, you know, fulfilling whatever effect they desire. So that's a good distinction. Thank you for explaining that.
Yeah, I think dose layering is another attempt, right? Like using both dosage forms. You can use inhalables because they work for you at bedtime or whatever, but
Mm-hmm.
incorporating those orals are a major part of it, treating anything medicinally. Just
Mm-hmm.
because, like, if you're dealing with a chronic condition, the idea is you want to get to something known as steady state. So you're taking the same dose every day for a certain amount of days, and then the body will come to equilibrium.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a goal in medicine when we're treating pharmacologically for a non-acute purpose. If you just have an anxiety attack or you just have pain at certain times of the day or when you injure it after a sporting event. All those are reasons to take it as needed, sort of one off, kind of like an inhaler for asthma. But when we're
Hmm.
treating your asthma maintenance wise, we give you a steroid every morning. We give you a medicine to help reduce vasoconstriction throughout the whole day, not just as needed inhalers.
Right. So my next question, and this is going to be interesting, is when do you think Western medicine is going to accept cannabis in the hospital setting?
Well, we're already there in California. If you're 65 and over and you have a medical marijuana card, you're legally entitled to use your oral, not
Mhm.
inhalable, your oral cannabis medicine in the healthcare institution. So soon, in a lot of ways. Accepted versus allowed, that is
Mhm.
a different question, and that is a much longer timeline. I don't expect the Western system to adopt cannabis anytime too soon.
Interesting. Yeah, because I'm wondering how. So you're pharmacist during the day, and then later on, like you're doing research outside of that. And which school are you going to do your research on cannabis?
Great question. So I practice in a Southern California hospital, so I see cannabis both medically, whether that's CBD for epilepsy or whether
Hmm.
it's cannabis hyperemesis from overconsumption of THC. I see that regularly. I'm a professor at UCI, so I'm trying to work with them through any of the formalized research that I'm doing, and that is a big focus of mine. I'm a former student at U Maryland, UMB, so I collaborate with them sometimes, and we're looking to partner with universities more often. We did a cannabis CE for the University of Southern California, which is also teaching their pharmacists about cannabis medicine. So education is making progress.
That's fascinating, and it's so awesome to see that this is blossoming into more and more research that's being allowed and getting more grants for. So super pumped to see what you guys are coming up with, because this is definitely a necessity, especially, going back to the beginning of the podcast of how you emphasize education as being number one priority.
Yeah, I mean, it's how we change the future. We can change the way things go down by introducing these concepts much earlier to students.
With that being said, which college or university is offering a much more comprehensive approach to cannabis science right now?
Ooh, there's so many, Dorian. I don't
Yeah,
even want to list it. Leafly has a good list of all the programs. It
Leaf.
really depends on what you want to do after you graduate. I went to the UMB program. I know that the University of Mont has a medical program that's pretty well established.
Mhm.
Who's in Pennsylvania? There's a school, Pennsylvania Health, Philadelphia Health Sciences, or whatever they just rebranded as, has a really nice program. Drexel's got a cool program. Oh man, there's so many. Michigan as a state has some really cool cannabis chemistry things going. There's hemp schools to grow hemp. Like it really depends on what you want to do.
Awesome. I'll have to look into all those. So, what excites you the most about the cannabis industry?
That it's going to continue to be dynamic. That it is unpredictable, and that means that nobody's guaranteed, right? If you would have come in 10 years ago and you would have looked, you would have been, oh, Canopy Growth Company, they got all the money, they're going to run the world. Tilray, oh, look at them, they're going to run this, right?
Hmm.
Hundreds of millions of dollars, Dorian,
Right.
gone. And here we are, another reset happening right now. And I promise you it won't be the last one either. So, as much as I hate that it's illegal and it's bullshit and legalize all nature, I mean, that's what's kept it exciting for people. And also what has made it heartbreaking for so many others.
Yeah, no, it's I've seen this up and down for sure of what's going down in each state as new states come online with their recreational programs. So in your opinion, do you think they should start out with medical and be that way before any consideration of recreational goes live?
Kind of. I think we need to make it medically legal in every state federally, and
Mm-hmm.
then you can have a different conversation around what states do with adult use. I also think that we shouldn't do any of that commercialization until the federal government lets out every damn cannabis prisoner there is. I don't think that we can have a real conversation about the future of the industry and throw parties and celebrate our accomplishments when people are in jail for this fucking plant. Sorry, pardon my French. But like I would say that has to happen as well. Sure, medical cannabis, ensure the rights of medical patients, and also free the cannabis prisoners.
Yeah, that is a big part that gets looked over, and I love the passion behind what you're saying, and this is why I'm putting together this project because people need to understand that although all of this is pushing forward for cannabis to be recognized as a medicine, there are still people that are incarcerated in multiple states that are facing long sentences. And even with the states that have come online, those prisoners are still in jail. Like, what the
Mm-hmm.
fuck?
Yep, exactly.
No, it's definitely a dynamic and complex industry that continues to evolve, and the people that are true proponents of this plant will continue to have their voice come to the surface to keep pushing for us to get to this place where no one is criminalized for this, and then we can start focusing on getting this to a level of standard that's recognized by the federal government. And that leads me into my next question. How do you think how do you think this plant should be tested standard wise so that there is a level of consistency? Because we see, this variability in a lot of products that are available to the public. What do you think practices standard wise needs to happen to be consistent?
We need an international standard. There's nothing special about weed in America versus weed in Canada versus cannabis in Europe versus hemp in China. It's the same plant. We need to come up with an international standard. We could get into it, but like, I don't like anything that's zero tolerance. I think anything like no bacteria, no microbe, no anything is a hard road to go down. I think that
Mm-hmm.
we need to adopt standards that look more like food and look less like drugs in cannabis as a botanical product. And then
Mm-hmm.
if we make drugs out of it for medical applications, et cetera, then apply drug standards to them. So I think we need to stop reinventing the wheel, and we need to consider what already exists out there for other smokable botanicals and what already exists out there for other ingestible substances.
Okay. Yeah, no, that I like that approach. That is definitely something to be recognized for sure because with science, I mean, I was talking about this in the last podcast with all the COVID variants and how internationally we collaborated to get to a place where we could develop a vaccine that targeted all different kinds of variants, and that was through international collaboration. So, with the research that's being done now, I think with other countries coming on board to join cannabis, I hope that there is a push for that collaboration to get to that standardization.
We need to as an industry.
Yeah, no, it's very fascinating. The other question that I had for you is that can you break down any of your current projects that you're working on?
Of course. So I continue to teach at UCI. So I'll
Mm-hmm.
teach pharmacists about cannabis pharmacology. Excited to
Mm-hmm.
do that. And then working on, in particular, one research project focusing on cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome, which is a subset of cyclic vomiting that heavy cannabis users develop over long periods of time.
Yeah.
And so I'm trying to do a patient profile and understand who are these individuals, what are their consumption habits, what do we know about them, what are their symptoms, etc.
Is there a high prevalence of hyperemesis that's coming on online? Are you recognizing that?
There is a increasing prevalence and incidence of this disorder.
And is there any indications as to why? Is it because of, I'm sorry, could it be because of the potency of products being released?
It seems like a pretty reasonable deduction. Here's what I'll say to that. A, studies suggest that there is a partial genetic component to CHS.
Mm-hmm.
B, cannabis has never been as strong as it is today, and that's statistically what all the data suggests. C, at least on average. And then C, never in history have so many people been opting in for cannabis instead of any of the other substances. It's never been as widely used. So it's stronger, it's more prevalent, more people are using it. So I'm not surprised to see it increasing. It's also
Mm-hmm.
only recently defined, right? So a lot of times there's this problem with conditions um, where once we discover them and name them, then they increase really quickly because people now know what to ascribe it to. So there's a wide picture of things, but I would say
Mm-hmm.
increasing potency, increasing consumption, and that now more recently we figured out there's a genetic component. So probably that. It's probably that a lot more people are developing it, but also a lot more people are consuming than ever did.
Right. Multiple variables to consider, and it's another complex condition that happens. And when I was working in the ER a couple years ago, when Nevada went online in 2016 for recreational, there were definitely a lot of patients that used cannabis regularly, and they would come in with this condition, not knowing how it started or, why they were experiencing these cyclic vomiting events. And it was sad to see because it would just be multiple young people that just constantly going back to smoking and then just having chronic vomiting episodes, and I didn't understand how that was happening. So it's awesome to see that you're doing research on this right now.
Trying to, there's a lot of
Yeah.
misnomers and misunderstandings around what it is, lack of knowledge, and then also blaming pesticides, which at this time
Mm-hmm.
there's no credible evidence to suggest that it is
Mm-hmm.
pesticides and just not related to THC itself.
Mm-hmm.
I'm open to that idea. It's just because something has not been tested for. Yes, we can't rule it out, but that's also not a reason to rule it in. So no one has specifically looked at pesticides, but yeah. So we need to keep researching. Yes.
Yeah, for sure. So this has been an enlightening conversation, and I know you have so much more to share. But I want to wrap up with some closing questions, like personally about you.
Let's
I
do
like to
it.
do this with guests. So first one is, what's your favorite podcast to listen to?
Ooh, that's tough. In cannabis, it's
Yeah.
Curious About Cannabis, Jason Wilson. And then
Okay.
in life, it's Modern Wisdom with Chris Williams.
Love it.
And I
Second
love
question.
podcasts, by the way. I listen to a lot of them. Those two are both stellar. Check them both out.
I'm gonna listen to, yeah, I'm gonna listen to the Curious About Cannabis. I have not seen that one, and I like the recommendation. I listen to a ton of podcasts myself, so I feel you on that.
Yeah, check out Jason's episodes. So he has like 80 behind the scenes, but he
Mhm.
turns them into like long form episodes.
Mhm.
They're great.
Okay, I'm gonna check that out. Second question: what's your favorite book?
As someone who doesn't read enough, this is a hard question. I would say the last book that I read and couldn't put down was The Botany of Desire by
Botany
Michael
of
Pollan.
Desire. Okay, look into that one as well.
Michael
What
Pollan's great.
are what are your favorite hobbies outside of cannabis research?
Cannabis smoking.
Mm-hmm.
No, it's funny. So I love my garden. I love growing all sorts of plants. I love my bulldogs. I spend a lot of time caring, loving, and snuggling with them. I play hockey and soccer. I'm a sports guy. I like, again, soccer, hockey, football, um, and just bullshitting with friends, going out. I love craft beer. I like barbecuing and smoking things. Pretty regular dude outside of this pharmacology problem I have.
Yeah, no, I mean, you're in the perfect place on the West Coast for it. All of that.
Pretty much everything I listed. Yeah, I love doing over here.
Yeah.
And I try to get outside as much as I can. I'm an avid hiker, backpacker. I know nothing makes me feel more connected in the present than being in nature.
Yeah, absolutely. Love that. That's why I went to Oregon for 4 years. Loved every moment of it.
Yeah, I would agree more.
Uh, and last question, what advice would you give to someone who wants to get into a STEM career?
I would say don't force it. Follow what you're good at, what you learn to be you're good at. Like you're going to be good at some things and naturally not good at others. Lean into those things that you're good at and find a way to help them make money. It'll all come together eventually. If you don't like your job, if you don't like what you're doing, you're on a like a time limit, a timer. Eventually, something's gonna break, something's gonna not work. But if you keep following what you love, maybe keeping that backup job that you don't or whatever on the side, but you got to find that thing you're passionate about, that thing you're good at, and just keep chugging away. Don't accept, a good job.
Love that. Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with that last statement. Well, thank you, Dr. Codi Peterson, for taking the time to come on and share your wisdom. I hope to have you on a future episode. And thank you again.
You bet, Dorian. Thanks again for having me. Make sure you check out my Instagram, Cannabis PharmD, and our website, Cannigma.com. That's CANNIGMA.com.
Perfect. I'm going to put that in the show notes.
Sick.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dorian.
Hey y'all, if you enjoyed that episode, please look up Dr. Codi Peterson at the website called Cannigma and on his social media accounts. They're in the show notes. Until next time, don't stop blabbing.